Continue The Fisher King from Jessie L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance, which is chapter 9, isn't it? Yeah, very fitting for a chapter 9. Robert de Braun is the only writer who gives a clear and tolerably reasonable account of why the Guardian of the Grail bears the title of Fisher King. In other cases, such as the poems of Chrétien and Wolfram, the name is connected with his partiality for fishing, an obvious post hoc addition. Remember the King of Cups card and the Golden Dawn tarot and some other ones like that? The king's holding a sea creature in a cup, which can tie more to something else I'll bring up. The story in question is found in Baron's Joseph of Arimathea. Here we are told how, during the wanderings of that holy man and his companions in the wilderness, certain of the company fell into sin. By the command of God, Bronze, Joseph's brother-in-law, caught a fish, which, with the Grail, provided a mystic meal of which the unworthy cannot partake. Thus the sinners were separated from the righteous. Henceforward, Bronze was known as the rich fisher. It is noteworthy, however, that in the Perceval romance ascribed to Bronze, the title is, as a rule, Roi Fisture, not Rich Fisture. And the rumbling of the stomach at the mention of the fish meal. But, which you can tie actually, well, I guess that note's better for another time, isn't it? Moses and his companion wanted a meal, so they had a fish. Now, whether the fish was soaking in salt water or whether it was a prepared fish and they just left it somewhere, the story amounts to about the same thing. And forgetting their fish was, part of the lesson, right? And it's a hint to the further age. The fish, Pisces, the historical founding of Judaism, the vernal equinox, Helioco rising, the book of Maccabees, the first mention of Judaism is around that time. And the ministry of the person we call Paul, man of the city, and there's some other meaning attached to that name, but, the 60s, so... In this romance, and the symbolism of the salt, of separation and all that, but in this romance, the king is not suffering from any special malady, but he is the victim of extreme old age, not surprising as he is Bronze himself, who has survived from the dawn of Christianity to the days of King Arthur. We are told that the effect of asking the question will be to restore him to youth. As a matter of fact, it appears to bring about his death, as he only lives 3 days after his restoration. And there's a lot of stories where heroes, particularly European heroes, were said to have just survived to accept Christianity, or just to survive to have been beaten by Christians in some way or another. And the 3-day theme, which is, while predicted about Jesus, is not, the Bible doesn't really claim that Jesus was dead for 48 hours, let alone. When we come to Chrétien's poem, we find ourselves confronted with a striking alteration in the presentment. There are not one, but 2 disabled kings, one suffering from the effects of a wound, the other in extreme old age. Chrétien's poem being incomplete, we do not know what he intended to be the result of the achieved quest, but we may, I think, reasonably conclude that the wounded king at least was healed. The Parzival of von Eschenbach follows the same tradition, but is happily complete. Here we find the wounded king was healed, but what becomes of the aged man? Here the grandfather? Not, as in the Chrétien, the father of the Fisher King, we are not told. then perilous spouse is, as I have noted above, very unsatisfactory. The illness of the king is badly motived, and he dies before the achievement of the quest. This romance, while retaining certain interesting and undoubtedly primitive features, is as a whole too late and remania of redaction to be of much use in determining the question of origins. The same may be said of the Grand Saint Graal and the Quest versions, both of which are too closely connected with the prose Lancelot and too obviously intended to develop and complete the dowry of that romance to be relied upon as evidence for the original form of the Grail legend. And she cannot agree with Dr. Nietzsche's remark in that source 374 being the page, that in most versions of the Fisher King has a mysterious double. I hold that the feature to be a peculiarity of the Chrétien Wolfram group. It is not found in the Gawain versions, and Woucher, Nar, and Menessier. Gerbert is using the quest in the passage relative to Mordrains, and for the reasons stated above, I hold that neither quest nor Grand Saint Graal should be cited when we are dealing, as Dr. Nietzsche is here dealing with questions of ultimate origin. The version of the quest is very confused. There are two kings at the Grail Castle, Pelles and his father. Sometimes the one, sometimes the other bears the title of Roi Pesture. There is, besides, an extremely old and desperately wounded king, Mordrains, a contemporary of Joseph, who practically belongs not to the Grail traditions, but to a conversion legend embodied in the Grand Saint Graal. Finally, in the latest cycle text, we have three kings, all of whom are wounded. The above will show that the presentment of the central figure is much confused, generally termed Le Roi Pesture, but is sometimes described as in middle life, and in full possession of its bodily powers. Sometimes, while still comparatively young, he is incapacitated by the effects of a wound, and is known by the title of Roi Mahaigne, or Maimed King. Sometimes he is in extreme old age, and in certain closely connected versions of the two ideas are combined, and we have a wounded Fisher King and an aged father or grandfather. But I would draw attention to the significant fact that in no case is the Fisher King a youthful character. That distinction is reserved for his healer and successor. Now, it is possible to arrive at any conclusion as to the relative value and probable order of these conflicting variants. I think that if we admit that they do, in all probability, represent a more or less coherent survival of the nature ritual previously discussed, we may, by help of what we know as the varying forms of that ritual, be enabled to bring some order out of this confusion. If we turn back to chapters 4, 5, and 7, and consult the evidence there given as to the Adonis cults, the spring festivals of European folk, the mumming plays of the British Isles, the main fact that emerges is that the great majority of these cases, the representative of the spirit of vegetation is considered as dead, and the object of these ceremonies is to restore him to life. My stomach says, feed me for life. This I hold to be the primary form. This section has already been written when I came across the important article by Dr. Jevons referred to in a previous chapter. Certain of his remarks are here so much to the point that I cannot refrain from quoting them. Speaking of the mumming plays, the writer says, The one point in which there is no variation is that the character is killed and brought to life again. The play is a ceremonial performance, or rather, it is the development in dramatic form of what was originally a religious or magical rite, representing or realizing the revivification of the character slain. The revivification is the one essential and invariable feature of all the mummers' plays in England. Now, I hope one realizes that rather than just sitting down, we're going to read through the book of Scripture and, that sort of thing that people associate religion with. Originally, much of these things were experiences related, and they were instantly put into ritual. Well, not instantly, but, sometimes instantly put into ritual, either because that's the form that they originally bore, or something else to that effect. So let's not presume that everything starts in book form and then otherwise it's here's this and let's put and this goes into, singing and dancing and all that. In certain cases, e.g., the famous Roman spring festival of Mamurius Veturius and the Swabian ceremony referred to above, the central figure is an old man. In no case do I find that the representative of vegetation is merely wounded, although the nature of the ritual would obviously admit of such a variant. Thus, taking the extent and recognized forms of the ritual into consideration, we might expect to find that in the earliest and least contaminated version of the Grail story, the central figure would be dead, and the task of the quester that of restoring him to life. Viewed from this standpoint, the Gawain versions, the priority of which is maintainable upon strictly literary grounds, Gawain being the original Arthurian romance hero, are of extraordinary interest. In the one form, we find a dead knight whose fate is distinctly stated to have involved his land in desolation. In the other, an aged man who, while preserving the semblance of life, is in reality dead. This last version appears to me, in view of our present knowledge, to be of extreme critical value. There can, I think, be little doubt that, in the primary form, underlying our extant versions, the king was dead and restored to life, at first, I strongly suspect, by the agency of some mysterious herb or herbs, a feature retained in certain forms of the mumming play. In the next stage, that represented by Baron, he is suffering from extreme old age, and the task of the quester is to restore him to youth. This version is again supported by extant parallels. In each of these cases, it seems most probable that the original ritual, I should wish it to be clearly understood that I hold the Grail story to have been primarily dramatic and actually performed, involved an act of substitution, the dead king, in the first case, being probably represented by a mere effigy, in the second being an old man. His place was, at a given moment of the ritual, taken by the youth, who played the role of the quester. It is noteworthy that while both Perceval and Galahad are represented as mere lads, Gawain, whatever his age at the moment of the Grail quest, was, as we learn from Diachrone, dowered by his fairy mistress with the gift of eternal youth. The version of Chrétien and Wolfram, which presents us with the wounded Fisher King and a father or grandfather in extreme old age, are due, in my opinion, to a literary device intended to combine two existing variants. And you see that sort of literary device in the Bible. And it's not just names of God being more common on one side or the other. It's not as simplistic as that when it comes to that. But in the Parzival, Titurel is grandfather Tanfortas. Fremetel, intervening critics of the poem, are apt to overlook this difference between the German and French versions. Then the subject matter was well understood by the original redactor of the common source, is proved by the nature of the inquiry. But I hold that in these versions we have passed from the domain of ritual to that of literature. Still, we have a curious indication that the wounding variant may have had its place in the former. The suggestion made above as to the probable existence of the primitive ritual of a substitution ceremony seems to me to provide a possible explanation of the feature found alike in Wolfram and in the closely allied Grail section of Sana de Nancy, i.e., that of the wound of the king, was a punishment for sin. He had conceived a passion for a pagan princess. Now, I say it's wrong to refer to people as pagan, heathen, Gentile merely because of their religion or not being part of one's claim to religion. The Romans did not call people pagan or heathen on a religious basis. They did not call people infidel unless they were unfaithful. You're part of a different cult, that doesn't make you an infidel. Now, there would be no incongruity in representing the dead king as reborn in youthful form, the aged king as restored to youth, but when the central figure was a man in the prime of life, some reason had to be found, his strength and vitality being restored, for his supersession by the appointed healer. This supersession was adequately motived by the supposed transgression of a fundamental Christian law, entailing as consequence the forfeiture of his crown. Now, the Christian law is that you cannot marry somebody of a different faith. It's not that they don't interfere. You pick someone who's not going to interfere with your faith or otherwise be good for you spiritually, but, you know. Yeah, I've damaged the book with the. They put these stickers on the books. You know, the price tags, anyways. I would thus separate the doubling theme as found in Chrétien and Wolfram from the wounded theme, equally common to these poets. The latter might possibly be accounted for on the ground of a ritual variant. The first is purely literary, explicable neither on the exoteric nor on the esoteric aspect of the ceremony. From the exoteric point of view, there are not, and there cannot be, two kings suffering from parallel disability. The ritual knows one principle of life and one alone. Equally, from the esoteric standpoint, Fisher King and Maimed King, representing two different aspects of the same personality, may and probably were represented as two individuals. But one alone is disabled. Further, there are two in very truth. One, they should be equals in age, but not of differing generations. Thus, the Bleheris version, which gives us a dead knight, presumably from his having been slain in battle, still in vigorous manhood, and a Hail King is, ritually, the more correct. The original of Manassier's version must have been similar, but the fact by the time was compiled by the Fisher King was generally accepted as being also the Maimed King, led to the introduction of this very awkward and poorly motived self-wounding incident. It will be noted that in this case, the king was not healed either at the moment of the slaying of the brother's murder, which would be the logical result of the downie of the tale, nor at the moment of contact with a successful quester, but at the mere announcement of his approach.